I can speak to late game win rate though, and that late game win rates are really misleading because there's a number of things that can happen here. Since we're waiting, let's try to log in. Since we're waiting, let's go take a look at some stuff to like illustrate to you how late game win rates can lie. Can just lie to you, okay? So let's see. Here is a brush. What the? Usually this does this. Okay, here we go. Why isn't this bigger? I need this to be bigger. Whatever. Look, I'm not 4, okay? I don't know how to use paint. Let's see. Okay, so you got a graph here, right? And oh, I need to move this over a bit. And so you've got game time and win rate, right? And you might think, and then we'll put right here, that's 50%. So there's our graph. And so you might think, when looking at this, you might think it's like, oh, so if a character has a high win rate early game, that means they're an early game champ. And if a character has a high win rate late game, that means there's a late game champ, right? But it's not that simple, which makes these hard to interpret. And so here's some things you need to know about win rate in regards to game state. And that is, first of all, as the game progresses, all win rates converge to 50%. And the reason for that is that all win rates basically converge to 50%. And the reason for that is as the game goes on, it becomes less and less about who your champion is, and more about, did you win that random team fight on Baron and then end the game? And more about, did you randomly get caught for no reason, right? And so a lot of late games in League of Legends, especially in the average game play, are determined not necessarily by individual champion strength, but just like, there's 5 people and they crash into each other and one team won, I guess. Or, oops, that guy randomly got caught out and so we killed him, we took Baron and we won, I guess. Right? So there's... Sorry, I'm sick. And I am... So that's one thing to think about, is win rates converge towards 50%. That doesn't mean it's a complete coin flip, but it means that, like, your character has to be doing something special to have a higher than a 50% win rate later in the game to, like, account for that convergence. So, as an example of what this can mean, let's say you have a character like this. When you read this graph, you might think, oh, that character sucks early and then gets better late. They're a late game character. But this graph could easily indicate this character just sucks. Right? Because they suck early, but then they converge to 50. So this could just be a character who just loses all game. Similarly, you could look at a graph like this and be like, well, that character's clearly an early game monster and they suck late game. Right? Because look, their win rate goes down with game time. Also not the case. This very well could just be a character who's good early, and that's it, right? It could just be a character who's good early, or it could be a character who's good early and good late game. Jinx used to look like this back in the day, before we did a bunch of tuning to her. But back in the day, Jinx was a tower monster, and so what Jinx would do is if she ever won lane, she'd take your tower, and then take your base, and then take the game, and she'd win the game. And so she had a really high early game win rate, but that didn't mean her late game win rate, didn't mean her late game was bad. Her late game just converged to 50 like most other characters. And so reading Jinx's graph, you might have determined, oh, she's an early game monster and she's bad late game. But the reality was she was just kind of good all game back in the day. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that, like, win rate going up with time doesn't matter. As an example, Kale's win rate graph tends to look like this. And the reason this one is different than this one is Kale is not converging to 50. Kale is transcending 50, and she's transcending it quite a bit. And the amount that Kale pushes above 50 as the game gets late is kind of an indication that she's a really good late game champ, because it's hard to get above 50. Another thing that can be going on here, though, and this is what's difficult, is it's possible that the reason your character wins a lot late game, or wins a lot early game and loses more late game, it might not be because they're good late game. It might be because the people playing them, if they can make it to late game, are good at them. So what I mean by that is, Alistar used to have this curve. And you might look at this curve again and be like, oh, so Alistar is weak early game, and he's really, really strong late. But if you played Alistar, especially like 8 years ago, you would have known it's like, well, actually, Alistar was a character who 8 years ago was just terrible because we gutted him for pro play, and he wasn't particularly good late game either. But what this graph could have indicated, so this was, sorry, I didn't give you guys the context. 8 years ago, 10 years ago, Alistar was in pro play prison, meaning he was made very, very weak for almost everybody except Meteos here. And Meteos was one of the few people who could play him effectively because he was a pro. But if you weren't a pro, you're probably going to lose on Alistar. But his win rate graph looked like this. And this could be that he was a scaling character, but if you played Alistar, you kind of know that, like, especially 10 years ago, he wasn't the best scaler. And one of the things that this could have indicated, actually, is that the Alistars that get later in the game are the good Alistars. Because if you're not good at Alistar, you don't know how to get past your early weakness, and you just lose. Similarly, with Jinx had this curve, you could be like, well, Jinx just sucks, but this could mean Jinx gets weaker as the game goes on. But what this curve could mean is the Jinx players who don't win early game are bad. Because again, if she's like an early game champion who's heavily favored to win early game, if you're not winning early game, maybe you just aren't good at the character. And so it becomes more and more likely that the people who make it to late game on Jinx weren't as good at her, because if they were good at her, they would have won the game earlier. And so anyways, oh, hey Meteos, how's it going, by the way? Good seeing you, dude. I heard that Eve is a really good late game win rate. I don't know what it is right now. Does she still just one-shot you? And Mashy, thanks for the prime. But anyways, like, the thing I'm getting at here is that win rate graphs can be a little misleading. The two reasonings being is, one is they tend to converge towards 50. And so if your character is pushing far above or far below, that's usually an indication that they're pushing against that convergence. And then you also have the complication of, well, if a character is really bad early game, then there's some survivorship bias when it comes to who actually is winning late game because they managed to get there. And then if a character is really good early game and they peter off, there's some survivorship bias of, like, the people who got to late game probably should have ended the game earlier, things like that.